Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mom Project's first ever Mother's Monday Fireside Chat. I'm Allison Robinson, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Mom Project, and we are absolutely honored to have Valerie Jarrett joining us this afternoon for an intimate conversation that will explore some of the issues that are so near and dear to us here at the Mom Project, including the push for gender parity in the workplace, advocating for public policies that support both mothers and working families, and finally, the power of leadership and mentorship. For those of you who are not as familiar with the Mom Project, I founded the company about 4 years ago. I was actually on maternity leave, had just had my son Asher, when I discovered that over 40% of American women leave the workforce after having children. And I envisioned a better way that we could support women along their career and life journey. And thus, here we are. It's been a very exciting 4 years since we launched at the Mom Project, and we're very proud to support over 250,000 women in our community and are connecting them with some of the best companies in the world. And have shared that over $75 million in earning potential have been connected through the Mom Project. And before we formally introduce Ms. Jarrett and kick off our conversation, we wanted to share just a bit more about the Mother's Monday and how it came to be. I think we started kicking this idea around probably about 18 months ago at the Mom Project. We were saying how it's so great that moms are revered and respected on Mother's Day, but how we wish that respect and love for mom really carried forward into the workplace on Monday. And so here we are. And so Mother's Monday is just a really wonderful opportunity for us to spotlight ways to support women, moms, and working families. A focus that's now more important than ever right now in the midst of COVID. And so when we were looking for someone to sit down and speak with us on Mother's Monday, Valerie was the very top of our wish list. Ms. Jarrett has had a truly illustrious career that has spanned both the public and private sectors, taken her to the White House, where she oversaw the offices of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs and chaired the White House Council on Women and Girls. And she did all of this while balancing the demands of being a single mother. Valerie is currently a senior advisor to the Obama Foundation and ATTN, as well as on the boards of Ariel Capital Management Holdings, 2U, and Lyft. She's a board chair of When We All Vote, co-chair of the United States of Women, and a senior distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago Law School. And if that wasn't enough, Valerie has most recently added New York Times bestselling author to her incredible list of credentials with the release of her debut novel, Finding My Voice, now available in paperback. Valerie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm delighted to be here. And I just love the work that you're doing. And so to kick this off on a Monday on your first debut, it's just great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Valerie. That really means the world to us. So we'd love to start the conversation off by exploring your story. Your career, Valerie, has spanned sectors ranging from law to business to public service, ultimately bringing you to the White House, where you were the longest serving senior advisor to President Obama. We'd love to understand how you were able to identify and embrace opportunities that were right for you as both a professional and a mother, all while working towards your long-term goals. Was your path always clear, Valerie?
That's maybe the funniest thing you could possibly say. No, not at all clear. And if anyone had told me when I finished school that I would end up with a circuitous but interesting adventure that I've had, I would have said no. And the reason I would have said no is that I spent the first 10 years following like a straight line path that was consistent with the plan that I made in college. And I think a lot of us, you finish school and you come up with a 10-year plan for your life. And mine was go right to law school because I couldn't figure out, frankly, what else to do. And my best friend was in law school a couple years ahead of me. So she said, go to law school. So I thought, all right, I'll go and I'll figure out what I care passionately about while I'm there. And then I'll move back home to Chicago and I will get a great job and I will fall in love and get married and have a baby before I'm 30, thinking about my biological clock ticking away. Takes a little later now, so don't worry. And then I would live happily ever after, right? And so I went right to law school. I went to Chicago. I got a great job at a big law firm. I married figuratively the boy next door. My mom had grown up with his mother. Our grandparents were friends. Our fathers were friends. What could go wrong, right? I have a baby just short of my 29th birthday. Perfect. And so I look up and I begin my book actually at age 31, 10 years after the plan. Couldn't stand my job, couldn't stand my husband, was quite fond of the baby. Um, and I just would sit in my office and I would cry and I go, this must be somebody else's life. I'm leaving this baby every day to go to a job that is unfulfilling. And I thought, you know, my daughter will never be proud of me if I stay in this marriage and if I stay in this job. So I think the big motivation early on was misery. And it was a great motivator. And frankly, I had to do a gut check and I had to listen to the most important voice, and that's the one inside of each of us. And even though everybody around me, my parents, my friends, all thought I had like the perfect life, it wasn't the perfect life for me. And I will say to you, in retrospect, I felt like a failure at the time. I felt like everything I had worked for in my life before, I had kind of gone my way. I worked really hard, but things had kind of fallen my way. And this was the first time, both professionally and personally, I kind of hit rock bottom. And so I left the law firm and joined the public sector, working for local government in Chicago. Again, not on my plan, but I had a really good friend who said, you love the city, you'll be a part of something more important than yourself, and take this leap of faith. And you can always go back to the law firm. And I've never looked back and certainly never went back. And so that was the beginning of me really beginning to say, this is my adventure. And I get to reinvent myself and I get to follow different paths. And each step I've taken has built upon the one before. And when I look back now, you know, after 4 decades of working, it makes perfectly good sense. But at the time, each step felt like chaos. Really, truly, like, oh my gosh, I'm swerving. What happens if I'm not successful? What everybody's thinking, this is stupid mistake I'm making. And ultimately, in time, I began to trust my gut, and I tried to own my own decisions. And they were full of trade-offs, but it makes perfectly good sense now.
That's so powerful, Valerie. So much courage. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that with us. So the next question we have is, the working parent experience is certainly a roller coaster of emotion, and no one truly sits out on that ride. I think that's true. Tell us about a time when you felt like you couldn't do it all, where you were failing at home or at work or both, and how were you able to push through? And what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, so when I look back at, well, even when I was pregnant, I didn't tell anyone I was pregnant until I was like 6 months pregnant. Now I gained about 90 pounds and all, so people knew something was happening, but I thought if I told people I was pregnant, then they wouldn't take me as seriously in my work. And so I felt this need to compartmentalize and separate the two. And I also felt this urge to be perfect at everything. The perfect lawyer, the perfect spouse, the perfect mom. I can remember getting up in the morning, and after I had Laura, I would begin my day by trying to figure out how to get through everything I had to do so I could get home. I mean, that was my priority. And before that, you know, have lunch with my friends and talk to them on the phone and go shopping. And nope, I just want to get home and be the mom. But then get home and I'm exhausted, and I would play with Laura for a few minutes, put her to bed, do more work. And then at like 2 a.m, I would start making baby food from scratch. So, you know, at some point I said, okay, I can't continue to do all of this. And I felt like I had 1,000 balls up in the air at one time and they were dropping everywhere. And I remember my parents said, well, why don't you just ask for help? And I thought, no, I can do this all myself. And I thought, if I were just smarter or better organized, more efficient, slept fewer hours, I don't know how that would have been possible, but maybe this wouldn't be so hard. And then slowly I began to realize, no, it's just hard. And there are some structural and some cultural reasons why it's hard. There's some things that I'm doing myself by not asking for help. And
Yeah.
I began at that point to say, what about those working parents who don't have the safety net I had? At least I had a good job, I had health insurance, I had parents who lived a mile away. My dad took my daughter to school and picked her up every day. I had the same caregiver for my daughter from the time she was 3 months old until we packed Laura off to college. I mean, I had everything going for me, a safety net that was sturdy and secure, and yet I still felt like I was holding on by my fingertips. And it's part of what drove me to this lifelong passion of figuring out how can we make life easier for working families?
Yeah.
Why does it have to be so hard? And how can we tackle both the cultural and structural impediments? And how can we empower particularly working moms to not feel this drive to be absolutely perfect? Because that definition of perfect, which comes from the sense of having it all, is completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
And I think we're just too hard on ourselves.
That's amazing, Valerie. I'm curious, for the other moms who are struggling to kind of ask for help, what tips might you have for us to get more comfortable with it?
Well, to not think asking for help makes you less than. It means that raising children is challenging.
Mhm.
Working is challenging. Doing both is nearly impossible. And so don't pride yourself on doing it all yourself. And I think that's the mistake I made.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I can do this. And it defined me as like, here I am, woman, I am perfect. And that's just nonsense. And you're setting yourself up to disappoint yourself. And so rather than disappoint yourself, just start asking for help. And I think part of my challenge, and I know I have friends who are about 10 years younger than I, and they were better at this than I was,
Mhm.
is pretending. I was just pretending everything was okay. And I wouldn't admit it to myself, let alone my friends and my family. And when the ball started to drop, I really had no choice. I just had to say, help, I need help. And when I said I needed help, then people began to open up and show their vulnerability to me. And I realized that we had all been just pretending around each other. And it was really my mom who yanked my chain and she said, Valerie, you can't keep this up. It's not sustainable. And we're right here. And I think part of what we all have to do, and as I mentioned, I was very lucky, is to try to build a community around us where people are supportive of us and in whom you can rely, who won't be judgmental and make you feel like, I mean, I can remember I used to show up at the uh, potluck at school and I always offered to bring utensils or napkins.
Yeah.
And on my daughter's birthday, I would go down and I would order cupcakes to be made
Yeah.
at a place called Let Them Eat Cake. And I always felt like I should be making these cupcakes or I should be,
Right.
why? You need the utensils too, right? I was doing what I could do. And
Yeah.
I put all, and then and sometimes the moms looked at me like, oh, here she comes with the utensils again. And I can laugh at that now, but it was like a dagger in my heart at the time.
I love that. That really rings true for me. I am also the mom looking to bring the utensils. Valerie, that is so funny. Okay, another question for you. Many women in the workforce, especially as they rise up in the ranks, face an internal battle with imposter syndrome,
Oh, yeah.
feeling like they have entered into a role or a room when they didn't quite feel like they deserved it. So would love to understand, have you encountered imposter syndrome, Valerie? And do you have any advice for those of us who may be trying to overcome it?
Yes. First of all, particularly for women, I don't know a woman who doesn't have a little bit of it. And I think it's somewhere in our DNA. And then
Mhm.
external forces reinforce it. And for me, it happened quite early. I still remember my high school guidance counselor told me that there was no way I was going to get in my first choice school.
Mm.
And I was devastated. And I'm like, well, why not? And he says, you're not going to get in. Don't even apply. And there was something in me that said, well, I'm going to apply because I've been thinking about this for 4 years. This is really my dream. And let me see if it happens. And I did get in. But here's the thing, Allison. I thought, well, I probably don't deserve this
Mm.
because I listened more to what he said about me than what I knew about my own talent. And it took me until I got like a couple of sets of grades where I was doing just fine that I thought, oh my goodness. But it was a cloud over me. And I think maybe it affected my confidence in some way. And I've always felt like when I start something new, I just feel like this is such a stretch.
Yeah.
I realized it should be a stretch. That's why you should do new things, because life is about pushing ourselves way outside of our comfort zone. And it took me a minute to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable. And I think part of it is when I started going to tables, there was to see, increasingly senior. And then I would listen to the other people around the table, and I'm like, well, they're actually not that much smarter than I am.
Right.
Why do
Right.
I think, right? Or my first board that I served on, I'll never forget this. I had a question like right in the beginning, but I'm new. I was in my 30s. I didn't think I should be on a corporate publicly held board, right? And so I didn't ask a question. One of the major shareholders who had a seat on the board, he asked my question.
Wow.
So later that day, I said to him, I had that question too. And he goes, why didn't you ask it? And I said, I thought it was a stupid question. He goes, there are no stupid questions. Well, I've never forgotten that he said that to me. And I realized with practice, you just get used to kind of putting yourself out there. You're taking a chance, you're making yourself vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, we all grow. And so I think to those who are feeling the imposter syndrome, first thing I tell you is you're not alone. And so something about not feeling like you're the only one that feels that way hopefully empowers you a little bit. And then recognize that everybody else, they're probably feeling the same way. They're just not showing it. And so it's okay. Just work hard and always push yourself to get outside of your comfort zone. That's when you learn. That's when the adventure begins.
I love that. I remember the first promotion that I was offered and feeling that fear, like I candidly was about to decline it because I didn't think I was ready. And then that was the moment when I just grew. So I feel like it's just when things start to feel very uncomfortable, that's when growth really sets in. And your example really resonates with me.
Well, this is where mentors can come in quite handy, because you're mentioning your promotion. The first promotion I received, I asked for, and I would never in my wildest dreams have asked for it if at that point I worked for the city of Chicago and my mentor was my client. She worked in the mayor's office and I was in the law department. And not only did she tell me I should go ask for promotion, but she said I should get a double promotion so that my boss at the time would then report to me.
Wow.
I thought that was ridiculous. And she said, look, you've been working hard. I see your work. You've earned this. And I just thought, well, when my boss thinks I deserve it, she'll give it to me. And she's like, no, 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 forget her. I want you to leapfrog over her and go into the head of the department and tell him why. And if she hadn't pushed me as hard as she did, I would have never done it. And you know what? He said yes. And it made me begin to realize that you have to advocate for yourself. You can't just sit around waiting for somebody to recognize your potential. And it's okay to be a little scared. For the 8 years I worked in the White House, it wasn't a single day I wasn't absolutely petrified. And
Right.
that's the way it should be, given the magnitude of the decisions that you're making.
Absolutely. That sounds like an incredible mentor that you had, Valerie.
She was really special. She changed my life in more ways than I can tell you. And she motivated me to actually want to be that kind of a mentor for other people.
I love that. For people on the line who maybe are looking for that mentor to push themselves, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how one can find that person to really push them forward.
Yes, I do. And well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. Don't walk up to a complete stranger and say, will you be my mentor? That has happened to me before. And I've said, no, go find somebody who knows you. And I think one of the early lessons that I learned from my mentor, and maybe because at the time I met her, as I mentioned, I was in this horrible divorce and I'd come from a job I didn't like, and I'm raising my daughter on my own, and I was a mess. I was a hot mess. And I couldn't compartmentalize it. It was spilling over. And she said, what's going on? And maybe because she was a mom as well, and her daughter was 16, so she was much older than my daughter at the time, who was 2. And she just made me open up to her. And so I did. And I started telling her what was going on in my life. And we started talking about raising daughters, and we got to know one another.
Yeah.
And she saw my vulnerability. I wasn't busy being perfect with her. I wasn't busy just focusing on the work of being her lawyer. I became a human being to her. And I think we hold back for fear that if people get to know us, that we're somehow vulnerable, as though vulnerability isn't a good thing. And I'm not saying that there aren't going to be people who take advantage of you because you're vulnerable, but they will invest in you more. And then you have to do the work. You
Yeah.
really do have to work hard and have to perform at the job that you have. And I have seen people who are busy looking for the next job and the work that they're doing slips. And
Mm,
that's not the way to impress somebody. And so if you're working hard and you're doing your job and you're taking time to build relationships with those who are around you, and not just the people who are senior to you, some of my closest mentors started out as peers. And as your lives go on, people rise and, and there are new opportunities that present them where they can be influential in your life. And so that hierarchy that you begin with doesn't always hold. And so build those relationships that will withstand the test of time.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so another question. Valerie, do you recall a specific moment in your career when you realized that your voice had power? And how did that impact you going forward?
Well, yeah, I think one of the big moments for me is when I worked in the mayor's office.
Mm,
It's actually a good example. When I was Mayor Daley's deputy chief of staff in the summer of 1991. And it was a transformative summer. It was a summer where I met Michelle Robinson, who went on to become Michelle Obama, the First Lady of the United States. And it was also a summer where one of my responsibilities was to try to look for ways of making government more efficient, seeing
mm,
if there were opportunities to consolidate departments or streamline so that it was more user friendly. And a big piece of why I had gone into public sector to begin with was service for the residents of Chicago. And so making government work better for them was something I cared passionately about. And so together with the chief of staff, we worked on a plan to consolidate several departments and create a new department of planning and development, user friendly for the business community and developers and average citizens who wanted to get streamlined through the process. And we also came up with a recommendation for who should run the department. And I remember presenting the mayor this reorganization plan. I was so nervous and we'd worked so hard on it. And he
mm,
looked at it and he had a couple of questions and he said, I like it. He was a man of few words and few compliments, I might add. And I just felt like all that hard work paid off. And the only thing he didn't like was the person who I recommended to lead the department. And I was so despondent that he said, no, I don't want to do that. And then a couple of days later, I found out it's because he wanted me to run the department.
wow.
And so I felt like I created this new baby and I have an opportunity to lead it. And it was because I was able to go in there and really fight for this idea that I thought was so important for Chicago. And I was jubilant, terrified that he was asking me to run it, but jubilant nonetheless.
That's amazing. Valerie, while we're currently living in a time of great uncertainty, some would look at this as an opportunity to dig deep and find our own strength, resilience, and leadership. While we realize this is uncharted territory, what advice can you share for those looking to grow and learn more about themselves and their own voice during these times?
Yeah, well, let me say something I probably should have said at the outset, and that is, look, my heart goes out to so many people across our country
Mhm.
have either experienced the COVID-19 directly or seen it with their loved ones, and the added pain of not being able to be with those we love who are sick, let alone those who are dying, is devastating and creating shockwaves. And it is, none of us have lived through this before in our lifetimes. And then you add to that the economy. We just saw the jobs numbers that were released last Friday, over 14% unemployment, highest
Mhm.
unemployment rate since the Great Depression. And all of this is a first impression for many of us. And we're having to be resourceful. I mean, we're here today over Zoom because we decided rather than waiting until we could do this in person, we would do it over the internet. And
Yeah.
I think out of adversity comes creativity and ingenuity, and we're going to have to figure out ways of managing this new normal. And we don't even know what the new normal is going to be yet. And I mean, I'm old enough to say to you, I can remember at a time when I used to drive up to an airport, leave my car in front, go inside, meet whoever was coming in on a flight at the gate, and we'd walk out together. No
Yeah.
security, no problem parking in front. And I say that to my daughter, and she has no idea what I'm talking about. And so we've learned that was a new normal we had to manage to understand. And we will figure this one out too. And
Mhm.
my hope is that as we're getting creative, we're recognizing that we have to come out of this crisis stronger,
Mm-hmm.
not weaker. We have a lot of the inequity in our current country has been laid bare by this crisis. The health disparities, for example,
Mm-hmm.
um, the fact that people who live in close proximity to one another are at a greater risk. People with pre-existing conditions are at greater risk. And then you have to say, well, why do they have these pre-existing conditions? What is wrong with our current system in this country that's so incredibly wealthy as ours that we can't have everybody up at a basic level of healthiness going into a crisis like this? It also lays bare, for example, I know this is something near and dear to your heart, but the issue that people who don't have paid sick days or paid leave are
Mm-hmm.
often the essential workers.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're learning, oh my goodness, if somebody goes to a restaurant and they're not well and their choice is between paying their bills and showing up at work because they don't have paid sick days, that puts all of us at risk. And so coming out of this, let's do something about that inequity. Let's do something about those health disparities. Let's do something to make our country a little bit fairer and
Mm-hmm.
more just. And I think each of us should challenge ourselves to say, what's our part in that? What can we do? How do we feel empowered to be a part of the solution and to recognize that we are not idle passerbys in
Yeah,
the creation and strength of our democracy? We are the citizens. That's the most important office.
that's so true. Everyone, it's such an important time to be an agent of change.
An
Uh,
agent of change, and we each can do that. I've seen, I'll give you a quick story, Allison. I was in San Francisco several months ago, and a woman came up to me after an event, and she said, let me tell you what I do. She said, I have an ironing board, and I take my ironing board to naturalization ceremonies. I look up where they're going to be in my community, and I set up my ironing board, and when people come out, I register them to vote, so that
wow.
every newly minted citizen in my community has an opportunity to register to vote. That's just what one woman is doing on her own. Nobody asked her to do it. Nobody's paying her. She does it in her free time. She didn't need a table. She took her ironing board. And I hear examples of these ordinary people who just do extraordinary things all across our country.
I love that.
It gives me hope.
That is truly the American spirit. I love that.
Exactly. And we all have that spirit inside of us.
We do. Valerie, the community gathered here today is made of parents and caregivers primarily. So naturally, I'd love to take a moment to talk about the next generation. What is the number one trait you believe that working mothers and fathers should model for their sons and daughters? And what can we do to foster those critical leadership skills in our own children?
Well, there's several, but I think resilience
Mm,
is important. Um, People often talk about strength, but you get strength and courage and fortitude through having things not go your way, and then discovering that you have the resilience to get back up. And I think when our children are young, my grandson was over here yesterday, and he's just learning to walk. And of course, we're trying to make sure he doesn't fall. And my mom, who's actually an early childhood development expert, said, it's okay if he falls a little because he's got to learn he can get back up. You want to have him make sure he falls safely, but
mhm.
you want him to learn that there's not just going to be this little, he's not a little fragile egg. He's got resilience, and he can learn that at a young age. And I think figuring out how to continue that as we parent our children, and remember that they're looking at us.
Mhm.
And if we're resilient and they see us face adversity and challenge and get back up and continue this, to, to just continue the effort to try and do what we have to do in the course of the day and be a little vulnerable around us. I mean, I don't know. I grew up thinking my parents were absolutely perfect. And I wish they'd been a little bit more vulnerable, because I kept thinking, well, maybe I got to be just like them. And it's only now that I'm beginning to realize, okay, they were human too. So I think we have to show our children how we develop that resilience in order for them to understand that they can have it too.
That's great. That's great. So, Valerie, let's shift gears a bit and talk about policy. The pandemic has put a spotlight on many of the major issues that have been impacting the success of working families for decades. We talked a bit about paid sick and family leave, access to universal childcare, the wage gap, gender parity in the workplace, women being disproportionately impacted by COVID while they carry a double burden. It's a long list.
Yep.
Right now seems like the time to meaningfully push for change in some or all of these areas, since more people are faced with the realities of these issues than ever before. So kind of going back to our early question, how can we collectively seize this opportunity and impact change? How can we make sure we don't lose sight of these policies as we emerge on the other side of the pandemic, particularly from a policy angle? Whether that be public policy, or we also have company leaders right now who in the wake of this are thinking about implementing new policy change in response to the new normal. So how could we really make sure to seize the moment?
It's a good question, Allison. So, as I mentioned a while ago in our conversation, after my experience as a young working mother, it was really a wake-up call to what are the impediments to working families thriving in this century? And you named several of them. Paid leave, we're the only developed country that doesn't have a national paid leave policy. It's ridiculous. People have children, people have parents who are not well, who are getting older and need to be cared for. People have lives outside of work. Paid sick days. We talked about how important that is. I think something like 43 million Americans don't have a single paid sick day. Affordable childcare. Childcare in 2/3 of our states is more expensive than in-state college tuition. Quality childcare, and every child to get off to the right start needs quality childcare. A workplace flexibility, another very important policy. And I know a lot of when I was a young working mom, if I didn't show up to either my Halloween parade at my daughter's school or taking her to physician appointments, it didn't get done. And so I had to have the flexibility to do that. A workplace free from sexual harassment and violence, also really important. And where I'm seeing the paradigm shift in that basket I call working family issues, even pre-COVID-19, during the work that I did when I was chair of the White House Council on Women and Girls, well, companies were beginning to recognize that in this time where technology has made geography less important, that when we are trying to go after the most important asset we can, it's our human capital, it's people. And if you want to both attract and retain the most talented people, why would you leave half the workforce on the sidelines? Women are now half the workforce. We're graduating from college at higher rates. And I also think what's important now is that men are making more demands on their employers as well for that quality of life that they seek, that basket of working family issues that they care about too. And so we have shifted from those policies we just discussed, from being nice to do for women to a business imperative for companies and for our economy. And when you make that paradigm shift, I think that's when sustainable change occurs. It's where companies go, okay, I want to be rated as one of the best places to work because I want everybody to come and want to work here. I want to have the choice of the most talented people that there are. I want to make sure that I'm not training people, let's say in computer science, and within 3 years, women are leaving. That's the average number of years women stay in computer science. And the number one reason why they leave, culture. And so there's a light bulb that's gone off, I think, in the offices of CEOs. And then the question becomes, how do we make sure that it trickles down throughout the organization? McKinsey and Wall Street Journal did a study that was released several months ago that showed that even though the majority of CEOs get this now and recognize it's a business imperative to make those policy changes, that men still outperform women going up that first rung of the corporate ladder 2-to-1. So it isn't getting through the organization. You can't just will your culture to change and recognize that diversity and inclusion is a strength. You have to actually reinforce it. And I think that businesses need to start to figure out how to compensate people based on whether or not they're creating this environment where working families can thrive. And then we need our policymakers, both in Washington and at the state and local level, to pass laws that set a minimum threshold of what we should expect from our businesses in this country. If you want to headquarter here and compete here and go after talent here, there should be a social contract there between the business community and these important policies for working families.
I love that. That's consistent with conversations that we've been having with company leaders as well, Valerie. It really feels like gender diversity as a topic has shifted from being a social imperative to really a business imperative. And company leaders realize that gender diverse teams yield better financial outcomes. Of course, the cultural piece is harder, right? That takes a lot of work, and it's a journey. There's no silver bullet, which is what we always tell our customers. Valerie, another question for you. What legislative changes do you see as the necessary next step to making family-friendly workplaces and benefits less of a perk and more of the norm?
Well, number one, I think we need a national policy on both paid leave and paid sick days, a minimum number of days that everyone is entitled to receive, and they have to be paid. We have the Family Medical Leave Act, but that just gives you time, but without compensation. Who can afford to just take the
Right.
time without being compensated for it? So we need that. We also need stronger tools that will enable us to close the pay gap. One of the pieces of legislation that we supported was called the Paycheck Fairness Act, that would not allow employers to penalize their workers who share pay. So, for example, the very first bill President Obama signed was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act that told the statute of limitations, so that every time that you were discriminated against, it would start all over again. Because Lilly worked for like 30 years and had no idea she wasn't getting equal pay. And it wasn't until one of her male colleagues slipped her a note and told her that there was a pay gap that she said, let me sue. But by that point, the statute had run. But it's not just enough to be able to toll the statute. You have to be able to know what the pay is. And so transparency
Mhm.
is important. We encourage companies to take a look at your pay and see whether you are paying people equally for the same amount of work. I've heard many examples of employers who thought they were paying equally until they looked at the data. When the
Mhm.
data showed a discrepancy, then you have to close it. So there's no shame in having the gap. The shame is if you are not then willing to close the gap. And then you have to look at it again the next year. And we asked companies to voluntarily say they were going to also look at what are the underlying structural impediments that led to the gap in the first place. So I think that there's a lot that we could do both on the legislative front and also working with individual companies to help them say, are we paying people equally? There's nothing more disheartening to know that the person right next to you is getting a higher salary just because he's a man. And so how do we close that? And how do we ensure a community of tolerance? I mean, we have civil rights laws on the books, but it's hard to enforce them within companies. We have the EEOC that's available to companies, but it's sometimes they're opaque. And I find that in terms of creating the kind of work environment where employees can thrive, we need transparency and honesty and some integrity to the policies so that people understand what is expected of them. And so they know what they can expect from their employer. And the companies that are getting that now are the ones that are succeeding. And I think the nice to do initiatives that people think, well, diversity and inclusion is a little thing I'm going to do on the side. But when the economy gets tough like it is now, what's the first thing you cut? You cut the nice to do. You're not going to cut the business imperative, which is another important reason why these have to be in our culture, where we recognize how important it is to create those important policies. But we need the federal and state and local government reinforcing them as well.
That's great. That's great. I'd love to circle back to childcare. We talk a lot at the Mom Project about childcare, the high cost of it. In many places, accessibility to quality childcare is very tough. And particularly in the wake of COVID, as many are now learning how to educate their children at home, not sure when they'll be returning to school, it seems like such the right time to start to really tackle this issue at scale. So Valerie, what do you believe are the policies needed to institute childcare as an infrastructure here in the US?
Well, we have to make it more affordable for working families. And so I supported a tax credit, increasing the childcare tax credit so that families and it could enable them to access the quality childcare that every child deserves.
Mhm.
Have to make sure that we're creating enough caregivers who've been trained professionally. I'm biased in this because my mother founded Erickson Institute, which is a graduate school in early childhood development, focusing on 0 through 4, and recognizing those are important learning years. It's not just a matter of babysitting, it's a matter of helping them learn so that they get off on the right trajectory. So basically, quality childcare comes training professionals to go into the field, make sure that we're compensating them appropriately so that we can lure really talented people into the field, and making it affordable for working families.
I love that. I love that. Um, Valerie, I'd love to, let's see how we're doing on time. We've got about 18 minutes. What positives, I'm curious, do you see coming out of this experience? Will we be a changed nation? We talked a bit about the American spirit, resiliency, like give us all a call to action on what we can start doing today to make this world a better place.
Recognizing our own agency. I mean, I have been so heartened by the spirit and the empathy. Here in New York, at 7 o'clock in the evening, people go out and clap for the healthcare workers. There were several healthcare providers who flew into New York from other cities across the country who didn't have the level of this pandemic that we have here. And when they were returning home, the streets lined the streets to clap for those workers who were then returning home. I got to get choked up.
I
just
love that. It's making me
talking
cry.
about it, right? And there are examples of this, those folks who go in and show up at these emergency rooms every single day, putting themselves in harm's way for us, and the appreciation that we are showing for them. And not just those who are healthcare workers. I mean, I have a grocery store a block from my home, and every time I go in there, I thank the people. I pass a policeman on the street, I thank the police officers for their work. And I think that there's a lot more of that. I'm not holding myself out as any example that's extraordinary. Everybody's doing it. And so there is an outpouring of empathy. And as we are all consuming the news, we are watching these both very difficult stories and then heartwarming stories. And so allowing our heartstrings to be tugged, I think, is important. And I also would say this, maybe this is directed at the younger people, that I know I'm getting a lot more requests for visual contact than just the text that I used to always get from young people.
Yeah.
I think we are craving that human interaction that's been missing in our lives, and
Yeah.
the level of humanity that brings. I hope we will continue. I mean, I know I FaceTime with my mom twice a day. I didn't used to talk to my mom every day, but I miss her and I like to see her, and I can't hug her, but I want to see her. And I think that we have to harness and hold on to that. So when we do get back to whatever, or go forward to what the new normal is going to be, let's not lose sight of the humanity that brought us together in this crisis, the kind of goodwill towards fellow citizens. And let's hope it sticks, and recognize, we can all be that lady with the ironing board.
I love that.
Just do a little something more than we did before to express that humanity. Just a simple thank you to somebody who, particularly so many of our workers who have felt invisible. You make them visible by saying thank you.
That's beautiful. That's great, Valerie. Okay, before we jump into some Q&A, one last question for you. Valerie, what's currently inspiring you as a leader, a mother, as a grandmother, and as a US citizen?
Well, it is this responsibility to be a good citizen. And I think my awakening, as I described in our conversation early on, Allison, was realizing that I was in a job that wasn't fulfilling and joining the public sector. But we don't have to be public servants to serve the public. And I think what inspires me is the public service I see all around me, from these ordinary folks who are just trying to make their community, their block, their community, their city, their town, their rural community a little bit better, and feeling empowered to do so. And I think, look, when we're all struggling and we're trying to figure out how you make ends meet, and you're just the way I was as that young working woman, but a young working woman with a lot of help, and knowing how I felt like I was holding on by my fingertips, you think you don't have space to give, but yet when you make that little bit of a room, it helps replenish. It helps make you feel, okay, Well, maybe I'm struggling at work, but I went down and I actually taught somebody how to read who was struggling. And so there's so much we can each do. 10 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day, just do a little something, and you will get back far more than you give. And I see that. I see that all around me, all around this country. And again, it's part of, look, we have the privilege of living in a country that is extraordinary. And it doesn't mean we don't have a lot of problems and a lot of challenges and a lot we can learn outside of our own shores. But we also have some real strengths here, and we can't take those for granted. We can't just sit back on our laurels and expect somebody else is going to make sure everything's okay. No, that's not how a democracy works. And it works when we all chip in.
Absolutely. Thank you, Valerie. Your comments have been absolutely wonderful. I so
thank you,
appreciate it.
Allison.
So profound. What an incredible mother you have.
I have a good mom. And I think I've created a good mom too. I'm real thrilled with my daughter as a mom.
Oh my goodness. I love it. So if it's okay with you, Valerie, we have had a few questions come in through the chat that I'd love to ask you.
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful. Okay. Valerie, you said that each new career chapter you made felt like chaos. What made you feel like it was still the right decision, and what helped you choose the next step?
Well, in the first one, the big leap was just misery. It's a great motivator to take a jump, because I thought, well, even if I don't like it, it'll get me out of where I am.
It'll only get better, right?
Yeah, it's got to get better than this. And then each other move I made was really when opportunity knocked, but usually at very inopportune moments. I mean, I mentioned Mayor Daley asking me to run the department. I just moved to the mayor's office and I loved that job. And I felt like I was getting the hang of it. And then suddenly, boom, there's a new challenge on my plate. And I think each time opportunity knocked, I had to be willing to say, will it stretch me more? Will I learn something that I'm not learning where I currently am? Will it be an adventure? Will I be scared and feel like I have something to contribute and something to learn? And so when I look back at this circuitous career in the private sector, and then the public sector, and then back to the private sector, and then the public sector, and now where I am now, each of that kind of winding road, they were building blocks upon which I learned a great deal, and then stood a little bit taller, and then built relationships that, I mean, came in handy decades later. I recruited people to join the Obama administration who I'd gone to law school with, but followed their careers and kept the relationship going. And so just trust me, to the young folks who are on the phone. And when you look back, it makes perfectly good sense. If you built the relationships, if you took advantage of opportunities that came along, and if you realize that the worst thing that'll happen is you won't like it, in which case you'll go look for another opportunity.
I love that. It's so refreshing to hear you say that, and sort of the notion of the nonlinear career path. I think it's so important, and I remember feeling the same way in my career. If I made it to director by 35, then that would set me on a path to VP, and life just doesn't always happen that way, right? And we really have to get comfortable with what it throws our way, and look at it over the long term. So I love that.
And recognize when an opportunity knocks. It's never convenient. It's always, you're disrupting something in order to take a new opportunity. And I think the more you get comfortable doing it, I should say it this way, you get more comfortable doing it, the more you do it.
That's very true. Okay, another question. Do you honestly think that the cultural view of working moms has changed? Are organizations still seeing moms as a burden, and has the shift really been completed?
It hasn't been completed, but it's a lot better than when I was a young working single mom, where I felt I had to compartmentalize my life, and I couldn't let people think that being a mom was taking away from something. And I think where I get my optimism is talking to CEOs who recognize that working moms are actually a competitive advantage. Working moms listen, they have patience, they're collaborative, they make decisions. I mean, we have a lot that we're bringing to the table that I'm a much better worker having been a mom and having been a working mom. And so I think It's gradual, but I do. And is it taking longer than it should? Yes, it's taking longer than it should. But that's how change happens in society. And then suddenly it will feel like a thunderbolt, but we're still in the process of making that change. And I think the fact that we have data now that shows what you mentioned earlier, Allison, in terms of how companies that have gender diversity perform better, we're beginning, those are the building blocks of how we make that case, the business imperative case. And that's a paradigm shift that's very different than when I came out of school 40 years ago.
I love that. I'm so encouraged by the progress that I'm seeing in the workplace as motherhood really being viewed as an asset, not a liability. It's taking a while, but I do feel that changing. That's wonderful. Another question for you, Valerie. I often hear that we can't be good parents and leaders unless we're taking care of ourselves first. I struggle with this. What does investing in yourself look like for you?
Well, it's the hardest thing in the world when your kids are young.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, I used to feel any minute I wasn't either working to provide for my daughter or with my daughter, I was being selfish.
Yeah.
And all I can say is get over it. Get over it. It's just like that old adage when you're on an airplane and the oxygen mask drops, put it on yourself first. And so I would do things like I would get up ridiculously early, like at 5 o'clock before my daughter woke up so I could go work out. And that hour in the day is where I centered myself. I grounded myself. I didn't enjoy the working out. I'm not one of those people who likes to work out,
Yeah.
but I knew it was good for me and I knew it was for me. And it just would clear my mind. And then when I would go into her room and she was just stirring, I didn't feel like I had short circuited her, but I felt like I had done something for myself. And it's funny. My daughter was pregnant when my book first came out in last April. She went to one of my events with me and a friend interviewed the two of us. And my friend said to her, "What did you discover about your mother in the book that you didn't know?" And my daughter, who's now 34, she said, "I had no idea how guilty she felt as a young working mother." And she said, "I don't know why she felt guilty. She was the role model for me for what a working mother should be." And yeah, there were times when I wanted her home and I probably tortured her because she wasn't there. But I learned that she loved me even when she wasn't there, and that it was the quality of the time, not the quantity of the time. Well, I burst into tears. I couldn't believe she said that. And I think what I want every working mom out there in particular to know is that your children are going to feel the same way about you. There was many a night where I had to work late and didn't get home. And for some reason, she does not remember that. I remember it. And it tears at my heart and makes me feel guilty. But that's not the goal. The goal is to raise self-sufficient children and be role models for them. And you don't have to be there all the time to do that. And so take care of yourself and you'll be able to be a better parent, I think.
Well, Valerie, as a mother who's often traveling for work, that is very reassuring. Thank you.
I promise you, they'll have no memory.
That's wonderful. Okay, one last question to end the session, Valerie. If you had just one piece of advice for working moms right now, what would you like to leave them with?
We haven't talked about this yet, so I'll talk about something we haven't mentioned yet.
Okay.
And that is to try to be, and this is hard, I stipulate up front, it's hard. Try to be present. I was looking at my grandson and I really don't have a memory of my daughter at 9 or 10 months old. I was there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I was present. And I can remember there's just 1,000 times, and we're all multitasking, of course, but try to find a period in the day, and it doesn't have to be all the time. I'm not saying, there aren't times when you're not going to think about something else, but just treasure and marvel their childhood, because it goes by so fast. And everybody always says that to you, but believe me, because now we've become friends, and you should trust me when I say this, is that it will be more joyful to you if you think, well, number one, they're going to be just fine. And number two, just delight in every little step along the way. Because before you know it, they'll be going off to college or having their own lives. And you don't want to look back and think you missed a big chunk of it. And it doesn't mean you have to be there all the time. And it doesn't mean you're not traveling. But when you are there, if you're present, it will make it easier on both of you on the times when you're not together.
That's amazing, Valerie. That's spot on. And right now, while we're all at home with our children, we can particularly take note of that.
Yes, you're going to look back on this and you're going to think so fondly, even though right now you're probably trying to figure out 8th grade algebra or whatever they're learning in 8th grade. One quick thing, and I know we're about to go.
Yeah.
And every parent who's homeschooling probably experiences this. One time Laura was in 8th grade and she asked me to help her with her math. And math is not my long suit. And I said, sure. And I took the book confidently and I started looking at the book and she looked up at me and she said, you don't know the answer, do you? And I said, no, but I can figure it out. She goes, I can figure it out. Give me the book back. So if you're feeling that way today, just know you'll be laughing about it tomorrow. And that's a part of life as well. These stresses and moments of anxiety that every single parent feels when they're grown up and they're fine, you go, oh, all that worrying. But then you also think, well, maybe if I hadn't worried, they wouldn't have turned out so well.
I love that. Well, Valerie, you are such an inspiration to me and so many other mothers. On behalf of the Mom Project, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your thoughts with us and for all of the incredible work you're doing on a national scale to make the world a better place for mothers and caregivers and families. We appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you, Allison. And I wish there had been a Mom Project when I was a young working mom. Believe me, it would have enriched my soul to know that there were kindred spirits out there.
Thank you so much, Valerie. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you again.
All right. Be well, everybody. Stay safe.
Stay well. Thank you all. Cheers.
Cheers.